Welcome to the Generous Business Owner Podcast, where business owners gain inspiration and encouragement to live a legacy, not just leave one. And now your hosts, Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and we have a very special guest with us today, Russ Crosson, who was the second employee at Blue Trust in 1980. We're going to have a lot of fun with his career story, a real career hopper after 46 years, Russ, and also written many books, including a recent book called Leverage with Ken Boa, and we're going to get into all of this. But Russ, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Jeff, thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
This is really fun. Well, Russ, as you know, where we kind of try to start on this podcast is just with a little bit of your backstory of growing up. Where'd you grow up? What was your family like? Was there kind of spiritual development early? Did that come later? What was it like in the Crosson household?
Well, Jeff, thanks for asking. I grew up on a farm in north central Kansas, a wheat farm. I'm the oldest of five, and my dad's not a believer. My mom was, so we go to church, but it was at a Billy Graham movie in the late 60s that I trusted Christ, realized that just being good wasn't enough to get me in heaven, and I was a sinner. And so it was a Billy Graham movie when I was 13 years old. So
wow,
that of course the Holy Spirit came in, started moving me in the right direction. But I really didn't grow until I met who would become my future wife's dad, who was this godly man, and I was inspired by that. So I thought, how can I become like that? And so I started growing, when I was in my early 20s. I became a believer at 13, started growing in my 20s. After I went off to college. I went to Kansas State University, and I went to all the Christian groups based on the girls in the groups. Right, that was my
right.
That was my real spiritually deepness there. But graduated from Kansas State with my master's in education, and went off to coach and teach. So I coached and taught basketball, football, taught math. From 77 to 79. And when God was leading me out of public education, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I got a letter from my father-in-law saying, don't sign any contracts. You meet this guy named Ron Blue, he may be onto something. So I met Ron in the spring of 1980 when he kind of shared with me this idea of helping Christians be good stewards. I thought, well, I'm a math teacher. I'm decent with numbers.
Yeah.
And I teach, so I'm decent with people, at least I thought I was. And so I put my wife of 1 year in a U-Haul. No, she drove along behind me. I drove the U-Haul. She took the car behind. We moved from Kansas to go to work for this startup financial services company. At the time, a little trivia, Christian Financial Management was the name of our company in those early years, because Larry Burkett had started in 1975 Christian Financial Concepts, which was a ministry to help people know the Bible had a lot to say about money. But Jeff, as you may or may not know, there wasn't any books about the Bible and money until he wrote that. And then 4 years later, Ron started our company in 1979. And so I took a flyer. I made the mistake of telling Ron what I made teaching. He said, that's what I'll pay you. Well, teachers got paid over 9 months. And so I had to make 9 months of income stretch over 12 months. So my wife wasn't sure she was real excited about that, but that's how I got in the business. Put everything in U-Haul, came to Atlanta and started doing planning, 13 column sheets, no computers back then. Everything was done. Racers and whiteout were our biggest office supply. But you had to be a real good planner, because you really didn't want to mess up when you were doing compounding and things like this. And so I've loved it, started then, and have been pleased to do it almost a half century now, which that's kind of a hard thing to say, right? Don't feel that old. I'm glad I don't feel that old, but I love it as much as when I started. So that's my story. And I still teach, our firm verse is 1 Timothy 6. We're in the instruction business. Instruct those who are rich, not to be conceited or fix their hope in the uncertainty of riches, but in God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous, ready to share. And so I'm still a teacher. I was teaching a bunch of snotty-nosed high school kids for 3 years. Now I've been teaching people, business owners like the people on this podcast and others for 4.5 decades.
And normally in most industries, well, maybe this is true of most industries, but you think of somebody who's essentially been in the same industry for 46 years. The natural question is how things have changed. I mean, that's, and you could do that. I mean, there's technology and some things, but I know you're just a little ahead of me. I found Ron in the early 2000s, sort of through Kingdom Advisors, but one of the things that we've both learned over the years is how consistent. It's actually less has changed because of the biblical wisdom that hasn't changed.
Yeah.
I mean, like when you think about that, uh, what are just some of the things that have changed or things that haven't changed? What are some of the things that are consistent and what are new
Well,
things?
Jeff, you said it. My son says, "Hey, Dad, you get paid a lot of money to tell people the same thing over and over again." But the Bible doesn't change, and that's the beautiful
Right,
thing about what we get to do. Obviously, everything's changed. We went from 13 column paths to computers,
right, right,
spreadsheets to investments have changed,
right.
but God's word doesn't change. The principles of get out of debt, spend less than you make, diversify, be generous don't change. And whether you're a billionaire or a person just starting out, you adapt those principles to the person, but the principles don't change. I remember a guy asked me early on what my credentials were. Well, I wasn't a CPA like Ron. I didn't have my CFP yet. I
Right.
said, I know what the Bible says about money, and I can help you apply that to your life. And so our tagline for our company is wisdom for wealth for life, wisdom for your money, wisdom for your life, which is purposeful and generous, and wealth for life, which is generational. And so, like I tell our people when I train them, you need to spend 85% of your time on the audience and 15% of your time on the content. Because the content you've got, but you need to know your audience. So this business owner, what does he need to hear versus that doctor versus whatever. So the genius of what we get to do, Jeff, every day is being able to take that wisdom from God's word, which doesn't change, and change the way you apply it to fit the needs of the person.
So true. And we started this podcast. I started this, as you know, with our friends Jeff Rhett and Alan Barnhart, and you know, the genesis of this was as business owners, we were all wrestling with kind of the unique issues. I've never heard of somebody say it that way, but I really like the way you said that. The principles don't change, but understand who the audience is. I got a little talk coming up, and so I'm thinking about who's in the audience. You got me thinking a little more. That's helpful. Um, so this audience is primarily business owners, and a lot of times, we think about business owners, and we were just talking before we started recording that sort of the person we often think about is somebody maybe in their early 40s where they start a business, maybe in their early 30s. They're kind of past the oh crap, am I going to make it stage? And of course, there's all kind of people listening to this, but what if we take that wisdom and kind of try to apply it? What are some principles, but then also stories? Maybe, I mean, I've heard you tell stories about the families you've worked with. I'm really looking forward to some business owner stories that you could share with us.
Oh gosh, Jeff. So, I hope there's a couple of things I can deposit during our time together.
Oh yeah.
Now, this isn't really a story, but it's pretty universal to business owners. And the biggest challenge business owners have many times is they don't separate the business from the personal.
Mm,
And so we've just started doing a presentation called Know Your Number. If I were to ask 10 business owners, how much do you need to make? I don't get the right answer. They'll tell me their take home or maybe their budget. But it's so important, Jeff, to distinguish the business from the personal because what happens is if you mix those up, you have some personal expenses coming out of the business, car and other
yeah.
things, and you don't really know if you don't know your number. Well, then also if you're married, it can cause marital issues because one month it's like, hey, we're okay. Next month, don't spend anything, and then next month let's go skiing, whatever. And so I
Right.
think for business owners, they need to separate personal from business.
Hmm.
And when I say, do you know your number? How much do you need to make to support your lifestyle? And I wrote a book called Your Money Made Simple. And in that book is a formula that tells you how much you have to make. And the numerator of the formula is your living expenses.
Right.
You have to get the living expenses correct. And then you divide by one minus your giving percentage, and your effective tax rate tells you your number. And so I'd say business owners need to know your number so that you make sure you're spending less than you make and try to smooth out the ups and downs of your business so you have harmony at home. Okay. So that'd
Yes.
be one thing I'd want to deposit is know your number, separate business from personal. The other thing I would say, and I'll tell a story on this one, is all business owners have to simultaneously walk down four tracks: estate planning, succession planning, philanthropic planning, and individual planning. And what I mean by individual, you have cash flow. Like I just said, you have to know your number. You have to put food on the table for your family. I've had the privilege of working with the Cathy family for over a quarter of a century now, and we've helped them with all those tracks, right? We came in through the philanthropy window. Dan said, "Hey, let's look at the philanthropy," but over time you have to look at the estate and you have to look at succession and you have to make sure all the generations their cash flow is working. And so I think and here's how this works. So I have a client has a business and his son was coming into the business, and so we were able to put all these together by making a gift of stock in the company to the National Christian Foundation. And then the son buys it from the foundation. So that's part of the of succession. We also were doing estate planning and we also did philanthropic planning, all as a part of a bigger picture. And so that's what's so cool as a business owner is you have the opportunity, but you don't just shouldn't think in silos. Don't think, well, I got my estate done, or I got my succession done, I've got my philanthropy done. They're all integrated. And so as a result, you should be looking at those things all the time. But what's fun as a business owner is you have all kinds of levers you can flip, and so that was a beautiful case. Philanthropy was done, son comes into the business, dad doesn't pay capital gain tax, son gets more stock, there's money in the donor advised fund to give away. It's just a beautiful thing. And so that's why I still love what I do, Jeff, as much as when I started. They're just all, in fact, I've got a big meeting coming up here in 3 weeks. A guy just called me and said, "Hey, you know, we've really got to work on our estate plan. My sister doesn't have any kids. My kids are in the business. How are we going to do all that?"
Yeah.
And so it's just fun to work on all that.
And I think there's a tendency, I wonder about your perspective on this. I see a tendency, I know this is true for me. Uh, Strategy, right, is this word that we kick around at work all the time. We get consultants, we have our three things we're going after, maybe a quarterly plan. If you're doing EOS, like quarterly rocks, all this. Strategy is a thing you talk about, and then how are we going to execute? And then I think there's a tendency, and I'll speak for myself. I know no one else listening has this problem as a business owner, but you can tend to kind of go home and collapse, right? And if the business is successful, sort of like you said, the estate plan, for instance, often, and you might do some succession planning at work, but the estate plan, it's almost like the personal balance sheet becomes its own business, almost. But you got to deal with that, and in applying, especially as things grow, kind of some of these business principles. How do you think about applying some of these business principles of strategy that most successful business people do well at work, but maybe don't apply at home because now you got other constituents, your family, and how are you going to communicate around that? And I think that's a little bit of a neglected area. Would you agree? And how do you think about dealing with that?
Well, unfortunately, the more you have, the more complicated it is. Everybody
Right.
thinks if I had more, it'd get easier. But unfortunately, the more you have, the more you have to have these intentional communication
So
meetings. I like to say
true.
that to the degree there's wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. So to the degree there's
Wow.
wealth, if there's not intentional communication about the wealth, it's tantamount to withholding affection. And so I remember one time we had a family meeting and we were going to leave the business to charity because the parents had told us, "Hey, the kids don't want the business." Well, they didn't know their kids. We have the meeting and we lay out the estate plan, and the kids like blow up. They blame us, of course. They think we've
Of
told them.
course.
But the point is, you better talk about this stuff. And here's the other thing I've learned, Jeff, is you need to have a third party facilitating some of this
So true.
communication because your kids will tell you what they think you want to hear, and they'll tell a third party the truth. And so you need to have somebody that can kind of say, "What do you really think about this?" Like when I started with the Cathy family years ago, I went and interviewed all the Gen 2 kids first. That was my first step. Go interview them, find out what they know about the estate. What do they think about philanthropy? Where are they on all this stuff? I go interview all of them, which gives me intel then to be able to craft a plan to move forward to take to generation one. And so you're exactly right. I think the mistake we make, let me tell you one thing about these business owners. You mentioned in their
Yeah.
40s the tendency to think you're done is okay, I've done it. No, if your business is growing, your family's growing, you need to put the word process. And like I said, I've been working with the Caddy family for 25 years, meetings, meetings, more meetings.
Yes.
Now the Gen 3s have come along. And so I would just say to that business owner, if you're being blessed, it's you just need to stay engaged in this process of intentional updating, communication, refinement, and don't think that, you know, and that's what, you get, the more blessed you get, the more you need to have these meetings. But here's the thing. Principles aren't going to change. So this couple that's coming
Right.
in a few weeks, longer term perspective, better decisions, no independent financial decisions, don't have a bunch of joint ownership as you leave your assets. So there's certain principles that will make your planning easier. Don't just go to your attorney and let him give you all this complicated stuff to do. You figure out what you want to do and answer a few basic questions, and it gets pretty simple. Not easy. I didn't say it's easy to do, but it's not complicated if you go back to the principle. That's how I started with this meeting a couple of weeks ago. I said, hey, here are the principles. And guess what? Once we applied those principles over the overall fact pattern, it's like, okay, here's our way forward. So principles will drive the process. And don't just start going with techniques. Get the principles down. Makes it a lot easier. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
This
But
is
business
this.
owners,
Yeah.
if you have a growing business, I hate to tell you, stay in the game, get somebody helping you because you have to keep talking about it.
Well, the picture that comes to mind in that parallel of strategy at work versus strategy, let's just say at home, okay? And then obviously they overlap in terms of, the balance sheet and all that stuff. But, if you think of them as kind of almost two separate projects where you know, nobody says they do a strategic plan for 25 years, right? Like things change. I mean,
Right,
there's
right.
most people have sort of given up on a 5-year plan. They're down to like three,
Yep.
like more popular one,
Yep.
let's focus on the next quarter, and it's like, okay, a 1 to 3 year plan. I think that's sort of generally accepted. But on the estate planning side, I love what you said. I think this thing of a process, it's not like you can, hey, when you were babies, when your mom and I had you guys, the third kid came along and we're not having it anymore. We did our estate plan then. And then, okay, the last one graduates from college, we're going to update it, and now we're done. And oh, by the way, when you're 20, if you're really in the top 2%, we had a meeting and told you what you're not gonna get.
Yeah.
Okay, mostly. Okay. Or what you're going to get. Okay. So basically one family meeting, and I think we all kind of want to be done. If we're being honest, I think what you said is so important, which it is the business is growing. Families are different. Like our mentor, Ron, always says, love them equally, but treat them differently. Like, what?
Yeah.
That's a radical concept that we could get into. But I think in another idea, that this thing you said about being simple. Okay, this is one of my favorite topics. Is the avoidance of we call it the template, the world's estate template. So in the example I gave, 3 kids. Okay, you got a business, some other assets. What the world says to do, divide by 3, buy a insurance policy to pay the taxes. And so we have these meetings where we just start talking about that. To unpack a little bit more, maybe for me, what you've seen about the risks of going down this road of alphabet soup before asking God what to do. Like unpack how you talk about
So
that
here's
process.
the principle, Jeff.
Yep.
Form of your assets need to fit the skill of the recipient.
Oof.
You want your kids to do what God's called and equipped them to do. So I grew up in a family. I grew up on a farm, like I said, but I'm not a farmer. And so if I get left farmland, that's not going to help me do what God's called me to do. And so
Great example.
here's the business owner. He's got 3 kids, like you just said,
Yeah.
got this successful business. And here's the problem. His name is on that business. And so he thinks of it differently than any other kind of financial capital, but it's still just financial capital. Psalm 49 says, man builds buildings, he buys land, he puts his name on it. He thinks it's going to endure forever, but it's not. So one of the lies we believe is that our business is somehow different than Coke stock or a money market fund or whatever, or a piece of real estate. They're all just financial capital. And I know you're tied to it because you build it, your blood, sweat's in it, your name's on it. The Jeff Thomas family fund or whatever you business,
Hmm.
okay? But here's the point, it's still just financial capital. And so if you're wise, you're going to begin to take those different forms of capital, your business and other things, and say, wait a minute, I've only got 1 kid. So this story I just told you, where we did the gift NCF, one out of the four kids was coming into the business. So we
Yes.
started 30 years ago. We bought some insurance because I said we don't know how the business is going to grow. Um, but we worked it so we were able to create equality to the kids, but
Right.
get the asset to the one that's going to run it. And that's another principle. You don't want to have a lot of joint ownership because you know that creates a problem.
Yeah.
The kid that's growing the business wants to leave the capital in. The siblings want distribution. So you go back to principles. Form fits skills. That's the first principle. Second principle is don't have a bunch of joint ownership. For me to own a fifth of a bunch of farmland in Kansas with my siblings would have been horrendous. So I wrote a document that said, hey, you're going to own 100% of this piece. Now I can do with it what I want to do with it. And so I think business owners need to be wise because 90% of their net worth is probably going to be in the business. But don't force your kids. That's the reason only 13% of business make it to the third generation is because the patriarch doesn't have the wisdom to begin to, we call it capital conversion.
Mm.
Begin to convert the form of your capital so that it'll fit your kids. Like I have three boys. Here's a story. I have three boys. One's in the business, one builds houses, and one sells coffee. So if I give them a piece of Blue Trust, all of them, and that's their inheritance, I'm going to frustrate two of them because
Right.
that doesn't help them do what they want to do. But so what I've done is I've said, okay, I'm going to start getting my net worth kind of, and that's hard for business owners because it means you have to kind of diversify. At
Yeah.
some point, you have to maybe simplify. You mean, Russ, I got to not just keep putting everything in the business. I need to pull some out. I need to own some
Exactly.
other stuff. Guess what? If you don't do it, they'll do it because they'll sell it. I mean, that's what ends up happening. I've told a lot of business owners in the decade of their 70s, hey, if you don't convert this to liquid, you need to simplify and liquefy. And if you don't do that, your family's going to do it because they don't want that business that you've got. They don't want that piece of real estate you've got. So anyway,
Well, I know. I think you're right on the money, which is so if you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna leave an inheritance that fits, that empowers, right? We're trying to give them a leg up,
yep,
not two legs up on the couch. We always like
yep,
to say, but something that fits, that empowers them. That okay, well, by the very nature of this, that means you have to think hard about what the kid's calling is,
yep, yep,
as you said. So let's unpack that a little more. I think there is this tendency as parents, we always think our kids are like 5 years old, even when they're 35 years old.
yep.
It's like little Jimmy. I know what's best for Jimmy. I'll just do it, and then I'll tell Jimmy about it, as opposed to listening. So this one of the principles we talk about is empowering, not controlling. So
Yep.
what are some other like practical ways that you can do it? We as sort of parents and business owners can do a better way of listening and understanding what our kids' calling is.
Well, that's why you need a third party to
I
a large
agree,
degree to
man.
come alongside. And I've worked with a lot of family counselors and stuff like that. But I think the principle here is that you've got to be willing to not have your ego tied so much into these specific assets that you've created that you don't have
Yes.
the courage to begin to convert the form to help your kids. So I had a client who said, that he was leaving the Montana property and the lake house to his two girls.
Yeah.
So we talked to the girls and like, hey, we're not going to Montana, Dad, if you're not there. And hey, we don't even live close to the lake. So you want to avoid, here's another concept I would share with you. You take the specific assets and project them out and try to have, try to avoid unintended consequences.
Yeah.
And the only way you can do that is project them out and say, okay, is this really going to work here? And to the best of your ability, you talk to your kids. I got another story. Guy has a lake house, and he's taking care of the lake house for 40 years. He has two boys, and I said, "What are you doing at the lake house?" Leave it to my boys. I said, "They married two girls, like to go to the beach. They only like to come to the lake." And you've got, I can see what's going to happen. One of them's going to want to fix so if they're both in charge, nobody's going to be in charge, right? Because, hey, we need to fix the roof. Well, you go up there, we don't go up there.
That's so
There's a
true.
train wreck coming. That's what I mean by,
Yeah.
so
Unintended
the
consequences.
point is, and this guy's going through a situation with his siblings where they're in all these lawsuits. And I'm thinking, okay, I want to help you you need to leave that lake house to one of them. Okay. You equalize another way because if you leave it to both of them, I can see the train wreck. Okay. So that's the point, Jeff, that that business and see business owners have a unique challenge because so much of it's tied into the
Yeah,
business.
yeah, yeah.
And
Releasing, cutting that thing up, it feels like cutting that thing. You know what I mean? It's like negative connotation
well,
to,
and maybe and so like in my one situation I just shared that story, we didn't have to cut up the business. We just started a plan a long time ago
right,
to get it to the person running it.
right.
And guess what? That's the one that running it. What you got to be careful of is your kids come into the business because they think that's what you want to do. They don't want to do it. I had a guy out in Phoenix years
Yeah.
ago. This is like 35 years ago. Said he was in his dad's restaurant business, and finally he quit in his 40s to go do what he really wanted to do. But he felt like he had to be in it.
Yes.
You know, and so you don't want that either. You don't want the kids that don't really want to run it to kind of be in it because, well, it's easy money and it's what you do.
Right.
So this is why it's an art, not a science,
It
but the
is an art.
principles never change, and that's what makes it so much fun. And why you ask what's changed in the 40 years? Well, software and all that's changed, but these principles have never changed. And that's what makes planning somewhat easy, not it makes it simple, not easy to do.
So, you know, I think the big picture that I'd love people to walk away with from this discussion. So there's some key principles about maybe not putting multiple names on things. It's going to
Yep.
create friction. Um, I even think about situations where you've got, other properties like you're describing, a lake house, a mountain house, whatever. You could even create an endowment. Now they're both in it, all that. But the problem with that is, what if one of them has the money to easily take their kids there and travel and do
Yep.
all of that,
Yep.
and the other one's barely making their mortgage payment over here, and they're like, well, if I had the money from the two vacation houses, I could actually send my kids to college. You know what I mean? Like it
So,
for me, it tends to keep coming back to simplicity.
amen. Amen, Jeff. Let me tell you, that's you take your specific assets, run them through, and see where the unintended consequences are, and come back to not a lot of joint ownership. You want your kids to do what God's called them to do, not what God called you to do. Okay,
Exactly.
that's the principle here, and that takes courage because
It
you've
does take
got your
courage. Some
name on that.
humility, some
You got
humility, some self-knowledge, some
that.
generosity, actually, just to the kids.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to thinking, okay, God's blessed me with a business, has my name on it, but it's still just financial capital. And I'm
Right.
responsible to steward financial capital. And it's just harder when it's a business. But the principles still are the same. And so just engage in the process. And here's a business owner. If they would just skim a little bit off, I know they won't make near as much,
Yeah.
but because you always make more being concentrated versus being diversified,
Yeah.
blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah. You're diversified to preserve. You accumulate your wealth by being concentrated. But if you just take a little bit off as you go along, you can begin to solve this problem. So when you talk about guys are 40, well, when they're 60, they don't have as. So the guy I talked about that had the lumber company, his dad, first generation, he kind of did that. He didn't have it all in the business. He had some cash. He had
Yeah.
some T-bills and other things. So it made it easier.
Exactly. Okay. We're hitting some third rails here. This is super fun. We're okay. I want to throw out another one. Um, and I like this phrase, unintended consequence. Run it out. So again, I think what we're fighting against here is the tendency to go, especially as advisors, is like, hey, business owner, go see the estate plan. You gotta go check that box. And they run them through the questionnaire. They kind of hurry through them. They sort of give them a standard deal. They don't really engage in this process of discovery of what's unique for each kid. And actually, what ends up happening, I actually think it gets simpler. It's more
Oh,
customized and actually simple. So then, if you can get a picture that you can say in plain English, forget all the acronyms of estate planning. If you can say, "Hey, I want Joey to have this because he does that," that would be helpful. He gets the piano because he's a musician. Whatever. Okay,
yeah.
like the business goes to the guy that's helping run the business. The daughter that loves the mountains. Okay, whatever it is. Okay, actually the planning becomes simpler. You don't really need, usually the techniques are simpler. So
Well,
I love this getting back, like narrative over to the numbers and all of that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
So
Like, yeah,
we take people through a six step process. The
yeah,
first question is how much to kids in charity.
right,
Then when current or later, now or through my will. And guess what? Your kids need to stuff now more than when they're 60 and you're 80. So
exactly.
but then you get to the form and then you get to the technique. So people start with what we would call step five, which is techniques, when they should start with how much to
Exactly.
charity, how much to kids, equal, when, form, and now I'm ready to do techniques. So if you go through the right process, it gets simpler rather than starting with, like you said, grats and
Yeah,
cruts.
yeah. Usually somebody walks up to you at lunch. I know this happens to you all the time. Hey, you think I should do a generation skipping trust? You're like, what's your name?
Yeah, yeah,
What's the story? You know what I mean?
yeah.
Like it's backwards, and people are like selling the
It,
techniques, and they're not getting the narrative. Let me throw another third rail at you. I want your take on this. This is under the again, well, all these are, but unintended consequences, right? So daughters, all right? You got three sons, I got two daughters, okay? And maybe because of that, my awareness of this is heightened. But ha have you seen situations like I have where large trusts are left for a daughter? She gets married, okay? And maybe the income from the trust is a lot more than the young husband generally uh, can earn, okay? And it creates this bizarre power dynamic. Have you ever seen that one?
well, I've got two stories. The first one is early on in the business, a gal called me and said, "Hey, I'm a third generation DuPont. I'm getting
Yeah.
married in a year and I turned 21 in 6 months and I'm a recipient of all these trust funds. And I don't want it to happen to me, but I saw happen to my mother and grandmother." That was her
There we
comment to me on the
go.
phone. So I said, so what we did was, Jeff, we designed a plan where they lived off his income
Yes.
to build up his self-worth and whatnot, and use the stuff off the trust to be more generous, maybe do a larger house down payment, things like that.
Yeah.
So that's one scenario.
Love that.
Talk about unintended consequence. I have another scenario where a guy was told to put 10% of his business into I think it's a grat, right? Where it
Yeah.
comes. So 10 years it came out to his daughters, and they were 13 and 15 at the time. And nobody ever asked him, well, what if your business becomes worth 150 million and
Yep.
they get 15 million at 23 and 25? And guess what? That was a horrendous deal. So here's the point. Remember I said project stuff out?
Yeah.
I think it was a great estate technique, putting 10% in each of the girls' names to get, he got 30 million out of his estate, but he destroyed two marriages in the process. And so I just think that here again, the principles, you're talking about some husband and wife
Yes.
principles that exist here. I just think that, yeah, you just gotta be aware of these things. Don't just fall into something with that guy. He never thought the business would probably be worth 150 million, right? He was just building the business, and so hey, yeah, 10% we'll get out of the estate. But if somebody would have said, hey, what if it did this? Would you still be okay with him getting that? Then he probably would have thought differently. I would have done a risk analysis for him at that point and said, do you really want to take that risk? So,
Yeah. No,
yeah,
this is and to me, because I've only been doing it for 35 years. Okay, you got a decade on me, but the what I love about this is once you run through those scenarios and tell the stories, because we just had a meeting. This comes up all the time with business owners. It's a growing business. It becomes a taxable estate. The default is to start giving it to the kids, okay, at very young ages. And
yep,
but then they're like, oh no, but it's going to keep growing, and then you just project, okay, the value is the X today. It could
yep,
easily be 10X. Are you okay with Junior at 21 having 10X? What? Well, no. I mean, what would that have done to you? I wouldn't have hustled as hard. I would not have been the person. Okay, so then it just comes back to simplicity again. You don't
yep.
need all these.
So
Usually, you don't need all these fancy things.
no, you don't. But if you start with that first question, I was doing an estate meeting, and the guy said, "What if my kids can't pay the estate tax?" Well, I thought that was kind of an interesting question because you and I both know you can sell assets and pay the tax. So what I assumed was he had a business and real estate and it's going to be hard to sell. I just said, "Well, what's your net worth?" He said 100 million.
Right.
His kids are 12, 10, 8, and 6. And
Right.
I said, we have a principle. You leave your kids less rather than more between 0 and 20. When they move in their 20s and up to the 40, you can maybe change the amount. But I said, you go by your attorney's office and don't, get a codicil, leave everything over the I can't imagine you want to leave them more than 30 million. You leave them 30 million tax free. Now you have no tax. But here
Exactly.
again, not So basically, you can simplify your estate plan and simplify your life with answering those first two questions. If 30 million is plenty for your kids, then you're never going to have any estate tax. I don't care if you're worth 300 million. Okay. And so I think, Jeff, that's the point that you're bringing to the business owners is, hey, don't just think that saving taxes, I mean,
Right.
and don't undermine, don't have, here's what I would say, future marriages hang in the balance. You don't want to have an unintended situation that you could have avoided just because you were trying to do taxes and move stuff out of your estate early, which that all makes sense.
Yeah.
But my experience in 45 years is I would be very careful.
But just think about the long-term consequences. And coming back to our mutual mentor Ron is how much is enough for you? How much enough for the kids? And what do you do with the rest? If you just those are just plain English. Now they're simple questions, but to your point, simple doesn't mean easy.
No.
But if you'll spend some time in prayer, thinking about what the answer to those questions are, the plan gets way simpler
And
generally.
the other principle, longer term, your perspective, the bear your decisions today. And that just needs to
Mm.
resonate in their ears. I need to that's what we're going to do with this family in a few weeks. We're going to project everything out. It's going to make the answer a lot easier. That's what we need to do today.
So we can think about their lifetime, forget our lifetime, think about their whole lifetime,
Yeah.
right? The arc of their marriage with their kids growing up, those sort of things. But then, of course, there's also the eternal. I mean, that's the longest term thinking, right?
Well, that's where you probably getting ready to ask me about leverage and other
Right.
things for business owners. You want to begin to leverage the currency of that which is passing away into the currency of that which will last forever.
So unpack that a little more because I think
Okay, well,
this is such a great principle.
so you mentioned the book that Ken and I
Yeah.
did, Leverage, and a study guide. By the way, we did a study guide. I don't know if you know about that, a study guide to go with it. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, here's how this relates to business owners. The New Testament says we're to give according to our ability. And for most business owners, everything's typed in the business. They take out a salary to hopefully meet their needs, and they have limited cash flow. And so if they're going to give according to their ability and leverage this stuff they have that's passing away and investing in what's going to last forever, they've got to figure out a way to not just let it all grow in the business. My concern, Jeff, for business owners is they're going to stand before God. He goes, how'd you do with what I gave you? Well, I tithed on my salary or I tithed on my dividends. And yet their net worth and their real estate and their business is going up like this every year. And that's not going to be a good answer. So you know why my guy gave 10% of his lumber company 20 years ago? Because we were wrestling with this at that time. Hey, your net worth continues to go up. We got to give some of this business. We can't just keep giving off your salary. And so if I'm a business owner and I'm going to leverage the currency of that was just passing away, my business and all my other assets, the real estate and all that, into the currency of that which will last forever, I've got to start thinking about stuff, giving away a piece of my business, giving away a piece of that real estate. If I don't engage in that, guess what? I'm just going to have this huge net worth that'll get given away when I die because I'm probably not going to pay tax. I'm going to leave anything over 30 million to charity anyway. So I need to get busy now thinking about how do I deal with this. And that's why I said early on, it may tie into your estate planning, may tie into your succession planning with your kids, future people coming into the business. But I'm concerned, Jeff, for business owners because I've seen it. They don't give according to their ability. They don't give according to their net worth, and because it's all in the business, they will Russ, I can't. Yes, you can. You could push that business and let the dividends go into your donor advice fund.
Exactly.
From the 10% or 20% you gave to the business or gave to the foundation. So, yeah, I speak at a lot of business events, and I just encourage them. You've got to deal with this. But you know what they do? It's easier just to make the money and keep building the business than
Exactly.
to just even think about this.
Correct. That's that strategy. You ignore the strategy sort of on the personal balance sheet.
So let me make one other comment because I just thought somebody asked me, Russ, what makes a good steward? I said, well, so I thought about it. Am I a good steward if I stay at the Red Roof Inn versus the Ritz, or I shop at
Right.
Goodwill? Okay, Jeff, you know what makes a good steward? You apply the biblical principle to finance, what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
But secondly, you allow yourself to be held accountable because you can convince yourself of anything.
Yeah.
See, so and the business owner, he needs that accountability. Somebody asking him these hard questions. And I don't care if you have a second home, a third home. I don't care if you grow the business dramatically, but you need, if you don't mistrust yourself and get somebody in your life that'll ask you the hard questions, you're never going to be able to stand before God. And how'd you do? Well, I tithed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why life's a team sport, man. That's why I sent us out two by two, man. You just have to have people you can be real with and some kind of accountability, whether it's an advisor or somebody else. But you got to deal with these things. And it's just easier for it's easier for me to lie to myself
Yeah.
than it is for me to lie to you.
So,
That's just
so,
how it is,
so you
you
may or
know?
may not know, but all the Blue Trust advisors have an
Yeah.
advisor. When I was CEO, became CEO in 2002, I implemented that policy. So we have to turn in, Julie and I meet with our advisor. I have to turn into HR. They get a one-page sheet, saying I'm a good, I don't turn it in. The advisor
Yeah,
turns
yeah,
in,
yeah.
but you got to mistrust yourself because you can convince yourself of anything. And I think the business owner that's going to be generous to the degree that he's been prospered, if he doesn't have accountability, his default will be just keep building the business.
Well, that's what the world tells you to do. That's
Yeah.
just that is the well-worn path kind of to destruction, unanalyzed destruction,
Yep.
to ignore it. And I think that's a pretty good full circle moment to in the very beginning what you said, which is it's akin to withholding a blessing essentially
Yeah.
by not communicating and dealing with this. You have to do it. Um,
Well, and that's why it all ties together. You have to get some liquidity to be able to be generous. You've got
right,
to, it's that's why that's why I love what I do after 46 years. You say, why am I still doing this? Well, this is fun,
right.
but it's like I said, it's not complicated. It's not easy to do, but it's not complicated. The principles never change. The
I know
my,
it. I know it.
my son gives me such a hard time. Hey, Dad,
I,
you don't ever say anything different.
yeah, exactly. Well, that's the beauty of not changing careers too much. Well, okay, as we wrap up, we always like to just think of some business owner out there, maybe like I described, starting to go well. They kind of have a decision to just kind of put their head in the sand and just do what everybody else does, or kind of go down this path of generosity and thinking hard about these issues. What that's a lot to deal with, and you've given them a lot to think about today. But what's something they can do tomorrow just to kind of think about this platform, maybe in a bit of a new way,
Well, you said it earlier, Jeff. I think they should make sure they have their personal balance sheet
Yeah,
and their business balance sheet separated. Now, obviously, on their personal balance sheet is going to be some value from the business,
sure.
but they've got to really separate those two. And then I think that'll give them some insights into, okay, oh, I need to take out a little bit more dividend because I need it over here and I can be more generous. So I think just business balance sheet and cash flow, personal balance sheet and cash flow, and making sure this one's feeding this one, right?
Yes.
It's feeding it, but you know, the classic case. I met with a guy and I said, "How much do you make?" He said, "I make 9,000 a month." I said, "Well," he said, "Is that your take home or your gross?" Yes, my take home. He says, "What's your gross?" Well, it's 150,000 a year. So I said, "Well, this still doesn't seem. Can I see your tax return?" Hands me his tax return. Look down the Schedule E, 1.5 million. So his income was 1.65 million.
Yeah.
But think about this for a minute. So he's tithing on his 150. He takes out the 400. You know how they do it. Business owners
Yeah.
take out the dividends to pay the taxes. But he has to wrestle with the fact I just made 1,650,000.
Right.
And it all gets back in the business. So that's my point. You've got now let's talk about this. Maybe you take out 50%, not just 40% to pay your taxes. Now you got an extra 100,000 to give. I don't know, but I would say business owners need to make sure those two are separate. Then they need to know their personal number.
Yeah.
If I were to ask you, Mr. Business Owner, how much do you need to make? What I'm asking for is, given your lifestyle and your expenses to live and give and pay your taxes, what's your number? And
Yeah.
I don't want to hear your take home. I don't want to hear you think it's this. You need to know your number. I wrote a book called Your Money Made Simple. That's got the formula in there, okay?
Yep.
But you have to know your number because as a business owner, if your wife or your husband are going to like it that you know your number and don't get the two mixed up. How much do you need to make? And like I said, if I were to ask 10 people, I always get the wrong number. I get their budget or I get
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
home,
Yeah.
but you have to know your number. That'd be what I'd tell them. No, do
Yeah. I
you
think
know your
that's
number,
great.
Mr. Business Owner? Do you know how much you have to make?
Well, and once you know that number, it gives you freedom to do all these other things. If you don't know that, then you're just kind of stuck.
You can't spend less than you make, which is the key to the key to this book, the key to financial freedom.
Yeah.
The key to financial freedom is spend less than you make, and you can't know if you're spending less than you make unless you know how much you need to make. So
Exactly.
not complicated, not easy to do, but not complicated.
Just go do it. Well, that's a great tip.
Key
Work on
word is
knowing your number.
simple.
Yeah. Yeah. Your money made simple. All right. Well, Russ, this has been a lot of fun. We could go for hours, but this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for joining us today. It's been
Well, thanks for having me. I didn't even get to talk about my leadership thing, but we'll talk about that next
All
time.
right, we'll do it another time. All right, well, thank you guys, and thanks everybody for joining on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Subscribe, share it with a friend, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Generous Business Owner Podcast with Jeff Thomas, Alan Barnhart, and Jeff Rutt. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can find the guest contact information in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode.